Welcome back. In this video, we're going to revisit method binding, which is something we've already discussed. However, we're going to go into a lot more detail and talk about the real pros and cons behind the different approaches for how we actually bind our methods. So just to jog your memory, or if you didn't watch the video where I talked about binding methods, this is the problem. The keyword "this" is the problem. And it's also really problematic to try and talk about this because we use the word "this" all the time. I'll do my best to not make it confusing. So far, our event handlers, at least the ones I showed you in the last video, didn't reference the word "this" inside of the method. They console.log something, they alert something, but they never actually used the keyword "this." But often we need to use this, like if we're setting state, or we're trying to access props, or just accessing the state, or maybe we want to call another method in the same class or the same component. So the keyword "this" is really important, this.setState, this.props, and so on. So without binding the method, we will lose the "this" context when we pass a function as a handler, and we get all sorts of problems from that. So let's see what happens when we try and move our quotes from the wise square into default props. So right now we have this wise square, and the messages array, if we look at the original, is hard-coded into dispense wisdom. But if I want to make this a default prop, somebody could override the messages through props. They could pass it in. I have another component called wise square with props, and I'm going to extract messages out to default props. So static default props equals, and we'll add the same thing, we'll call it messages, and set it equal to this array. Make sure I get rid of that semicolon, and I'll get rid of the comment as well. Okay, so we have this messages inside of props, and that means if I want to use it in here, dispense wisdom, I need to do this.props.messages. And I'm going to make a variable just to shorten this because we're using messages here and here. I'm going to make a variable called messages, and I'm going to extract it from this.props. If you haven't seen this syntax, this basically says make a variable called messages, and it should be equal to this.props.messages. So there has to be something called messages in props. All right, so if we try this, and I make sure to actually render this component, which is called wise square with props, not the most compelling name ever, but it's descriptive enough. If we take a look now, it renders fine, but when I hover, tragedy, cannot read property props of undefined. And if we wanted to make it clearer what's going on, inside of dispense wisdom, let's do a console.log this is, and then console.log the value of the keyword "this." Here we go. Scroll up through all those red messages. This is undefined. So that's not good. We need the value of this because we're using it all over the place. Well, actually just one place, this.props, but we use it all the time inside of our event handlers. We need to make sure this is going to refer to the component itself, the individual instance of the component, not undefined. Fortunately, we can fix this, as we've already discussed. There are a couple ways to do this. There's actually more than three. I'm going to show you a fourth in the next video, but the three we're going to discuss right now. The first is to use bind inline. The second is to use an arrow function, and the third is to bind in the constructor, which is what we've been doing. So let's start with that first one, binding inline. So that looks like this, where instead of passing through this.dispense wisdom, we actually pass through the new function that's a result of binding it to the value of this. So if we try it now, come back over here, I'm going to leave this exactly the same. I'm going to leave dispense wisdom the same, not this. And here I'm going to bind this. And let's verify that it works, and it does work. So now both of them are working, and this one is using props. So what's good about this is that it's very explicit. We see exactly what's going on. We know that we're binding it. There's no magic, no syntactic sugar. We're passing it in directly. It's all packaged together. We know what's happening. Unfortunately, there are some cons. The first is if we need to pass it to multiple components, we're going to have to bind it multiple times. So aside from syntactic messiness, if that's a good way of putting it, and cluttering our markup, which is personally one reason I don't like this. The bigger issue is that bind creates a new function. And if we're binding inside of render, we're going to make a lot of new functions. Now to demonstrate what I'm talking about, if we come to the console, and I'll clear this out a bit. If you're super familiar with bind, then you might want to fast forward just a bit. Let's say I have a function called handle click. It doesn't do anything. If I bind the value of this to it, so I'm going to make a new variable. Let's go with h1 for handle click is equal to handle click dot bind this. Bind is going to return a new function instead of h1, and if we compare h1 to handle click, they're not equal. They're different functions. This is a new function. And if I make another one, I bind it again, and this time I call the variable h2. If I compare h1 and h2, both are the result of binding handle click, but they're not equal. So this tells us that every time we call bind, we're making a brand new function. And if we're calling bind inside of the render, that means that every time we re-render, we're making a new function. So a lot of people get really freaked out about this as far as performance implications. Most of the time, the difference is so tiny, so minimal that you're not going to notice it. But that doesn't mean that you should ignore it and that you shouldn't try to avoid it. I just don't think it's worth, panicking over and telling you this is going to wreck your applications. However, there are some articles online, case studies from real applications that are production apps, much, much more complicated, where there actually were some real performance issues that stemmed from binding instead of render. So that's the biggest con here. We don't want to bind and render because we're going to basically make new functions over and over and over. And the same goes for this second option, which is to use an arrow function inline rather than manually binding. So it looks like this, and I'll demonstrate it over here. So we write our arrow function, and then we call this dot dispense wisdom. And we do call it. That's important. And if we check it out, it does work. We can verify we're getting those console.logs, and the value of this is the individual component, which is what we want. So what some people like about this is that there's no mention of bind. It's less cluttered, it's simpler, but I would also argue that the intention is less clear because it's basically a nice little piece of syntactic sugar, but it's still doing the same thing. So I kind of like the bind. It makes it clear what you're actually doing. You have to bind. We're setting the value of this. But the bigger problem is the same as before, as up here. If you're doing it inline instead of your render, you're going to be making a bunch of functions over and over and over every time you render. Also, if you have multiple components you need to pass it into, then you're going to make a new copy for each component. So both of those inline options, using bind and using an arrow function, are less ideal than the third option we'll talk about, which is what we have been doing, what we've been using, which is to bind in the constructor. We bind one time and we're done. It is a little clunkier, the syntax. This is a long, ugly line. I'm not really a fan of it, but I'm a bigger fan of this than the other options we've discussed so far. You put it in the constructor, it's explicit, you're still binding, and you can see all of your methods that have been bound all together up top in one big happy family. So if we come over here, we can refactor this. We would only call this dot dispense wisdom, and then up top, we need to make sure we have a constructor, which we don't. Best practice to do super props. We're not going to use it though. And then this dot dispense wisdom equals this dot dispense wisdom dot bind this. So it is clunky, it's long, but it's centralized up top. And the best part is we only have to bind one time. Let's just make sure it still works. All right, no errors. And we're printing things out. And the value of this is what we want it to be, the individual component. Okay, so the pros, it's more performant because we're only binding one time. We're not constantly rebinding over and over and over every time we render. The cons are really just that it's ugly, and a lot of people don't like having to do this. You actually, in earlier versions of React, you didn't have to do this. You didn't have to bind this at all because of the way it was set up. But now when we use ES6 classes, we do have to bind. Anyway, this is the way that I prefer to do it. But in the next video, I am going to show you an alternative that a lot of other people do like. It's considered experimental. I'm doing air quotes, but you can't see it. So that's why I put it in a separate video so that we can discuss what's good about it, why it's experimental, and if you should use it. But to conclude this video, I'm going to continue binding in the constructor. You can make your own decision about what makes the best sense for you, what you prefer, and I'll leave it at that. But we have to bind no matter what.